Blood Island by Ron Ripley. The small rental car shook beneath the onslaught of the wind careening off the whipped surface of Webster Lake. Dan Shea pulled the car into a narrow, barely visible parking spot in front of a general store that was probably built before Teddy Roosevelt was president, and shifted into park. He turned the engine off and looked at his wife. May smiled at him, dimples appearing in each pale, freckled cheek, and asked, "Well, what do you think?" Dan fixed his gaze on the run-down appearance of the store, the rickety pier that extended beyond it into the lake, and nodded. In the distance, barely visible above the water's horizon, he saw a series of islands, one of which was the reason they had traveled from Seattle. "Ready for some genuine, New England hospitality?" May asked, tucking a lock of red hair behind her ear. "Not really," Dan answered. "If the service we received at the airport is any indication of how it's going to be out here in the sticks, well, no. I think we should probably call it quits and head home now. Or at least to a decent hotel. If there is one." May gave him a mock frown as she unbuckled. "Don't talk smack about my home state," she said, her Massachusetts accent becoming pronounced. "America was born right here." "Where, in the front seat of a Prius?" Dan asked, feigning shock. She gave him a playful slap on the arm and said, "Come on, smarty." Chuckling, Dan got out of the car, opened the back door and took their bags out. He locked the car, nodded, and then followed May into the store. The interior surprised him, and he felt his breath taken away by the beauty and the tidiness of the large room. One entire wall was decorated from floor to ceiling with bookcases, each shelf filled with books. The opposite wall was dominated by a large fireplace, around which 4 old and well-loved leather club chairs were spread. A coffee table was positioned perfectly between the chairs, serving as a focal point, and the warm smell of coffee filled the air. Low shelves were organized in neat rows along the center of the shop's floor, and the basic necessities were stacked there. Prices were written in a deft, beautiful script, and the cash register on the old, marble counter was an antique most dealers Dan knew would kill for. Behind the register was a wide array of liquor, cigarettes, cigars, and loose tobacco. A handful of pipes were arranged in elegant stands, and the lighting in the store came from 10 chandeliers made of off-white porcelain, each piece decorated with blue figures. It took a moment for Dan to take the entirety of the store in, and it was only after he had done so that he noticed the man standing behind the counter. The shopkeeper was old, perhaps in his late 70s or early 80s. His hair was a brilliant white, wild, and untamed on top of his head. He had a beard that was surprisingly trim, the color of which matched his hair, and his upper lip was shaved. Clenching the stem of an unlit pipe between his teeth, his thick thumbs hooked through the dark red suspenders holding up his black pants. The man's shirt was white, with creases sharp enough to cut a finger on. He smiled at them as they approached. "Hello," May said, taking point in the conversation, a role she was both familiar and comfortable with. "Good morning," the man replied, and instantly Dan heard the accent in the shopkeeper's voice. It was a Boston accent. Not the nasally, long, drawn-out sound of someone from the South Side, but the clipped, precise voice of a man who had gone to Harvard. "What can I do for you this morning?" the shopkeeper asked. "We're looking to see if someone can ferry us out to an island for the day," May said. "We've flown in this morning. We're looking to do some research." The man raised an exceptionally thick and bushy eyebrow and inquired, "Which island?" "Well, that's where it gets a little confusing," May confessed. She took out her notebook, flipped it open to the page she wanted and said, "See, we did some research, but the only name we could come up with was something called Blutinsel." The shopkeeper's shoulders stiffened. "You know it?" Dan asked. The man smiled tightly. "As they say, would that I did not. I suggest you find another island to visit." Or perhaps a trip over the Connecticut border to see some of the sights there. May shook her head. We've flown all the way from Washington State. We're doing research on haunted places in Massachusetts, and this one, well, no one seems to have written about it. That, my dear, the shopkeeper said gently, is because no one lives who visits there. Dan waited for a punchline of some sort, and when it didn't come along, he said, "You can't be serious." "I am, unfortunately," the shopkeeper said. Blood Island, for that, is what we call it, is not a place people visit. Nor is it a place locals will travel to. I'm sorry, but no one will ferry you out to the island. May frowned, her face going dark. With frustration. What about a boat? Dan asked. Could we rent a boat? The old man's shoulders sagged slightly. Yes, I could rent you a boat, the shopkeeper said. I want to tell you, though, before I take your money, that you're going to want to bring extra food, water, and gasoline. We're not planning on spending more than a few hours there, Dan explained. We don't have any desire to camp there. You don't understand, the shopkeeper said, shaking his head. You don't get to decide if you're leaving. The island does. What? Dan asked, but he saw the excitement on May's face. The island will stop you? She asked, sounding like a thrilled child. The shopkeeper saw it too, and his face darkened. I'm going to tell you several important pieces of information. You will want to learn them and learn them well. First, electronics do not work on the island. If your devices are powered by batteries, they will lose their charge in minutes. I would suggest that you leave them in the boat when you go onto land. Second, do not touch or move anything you see that looks, well, interesting. The island is not your home, and while the one who lives there may tolerate you, he will not if you touch his possessions. Third, and last, do not speak with anyone you see there. No one. This last I cannot stress enough. Dan glanced at May, suddenly unsure of their little venture, but when he saw the gleam in her eyes, he knew there was no turning back. How much to rent the boat? She asked, her voice trembling with excitement. The old man hesitated, then shook his head. I want nothing for the use of the boat. He reached under the counter and took out a large, metal box. Setting it down gently, the old man opened it and withdrew a large flare gun and several flares. He set the weapon and the ammunition for it on the counter and looked at them. I have friends coming over shortly for coffee and chess, the old man explained. We will be watching the lake. If something should happen to you, get back to the boat and away from the island. Fire the flare as soon as you are in the boat. We will come and get you. Thank you so much, May said, almost breathless. The old man shook his head. You shouldn't thank me. I should be turning you out and into the street, but I suspect you would find your way to the island regardless. You're not wrong there, Dan thought. I would rather be able to lend you some sort of assistance, if necessary, the shopkeeper continued. Now listen, bring the flare gun and flares down to the boat. It's the only vessel tied up to the pier. The key is in the ignition, and there is an ample supply of fuel. However, you can get the spare can out from beneath the overhang and put that in as well. Do you have food and water? Dan nodded. Yeah. Some dehydrated rations and plenty of water. Excellent, the shopkeeper said. He stroked his beard, then asked, Do you have any iron? Any at all? Dan and May lifted up their right hands at the same time. Each of them wore an identical ring on their index fingers. The Malta cross was stamped into the metal, and the presence of the jewelry provided Dan with a curiously powerful level of comfort. Good, the shopkeeper murmured. Perhaps you will do well, then. Perhaps. The old man paused, then made them repeat the rules for going to the island. They both recited them, and a minute later, they were walking out of the store, the old man watching them leave. "Wow," Dan said once they were under the overhang, pulling out an old, red and beaten metal container with gasoline in it. "Right?" May laughed happily. "He is fantastic. When we do the story on this place, we are definitely putting him in there." "Don't want to creep out too many readers," Dan said, grunting as the gas sloshed from one side to the next in the can, making it difficult to carry. "That's why they love our blog," she replied with a wink. "They want to be creeped out." Dan didn't argue with her. The more gruesome the story, the more readers they seemed to acquire, which was what they wanted. Readership meant revenue, and revenue meant not having to work a regular, 9-to-5 job. And that, Dan thought, is just about priceless. The pier was far sturdier than it had appeared from the parking lot. Beneath his boots, Dan felt the solid resistance of the wood and enjoyed the thud of each step. Soon, they stood in front of the boat. It was named the Ella Gagne, and it rolled at its berth to the gentle rhythm of the lake. Dan and May maneuvered the gas and their belongings onto the boat, and Dan cast off before starting the engine. They pushed the boat away from the pier, then he opened the throttle and aimed the vessel toward the islands. May sat beside him, holding a picture of the island in front of her. "There," she said, pointing to the left. "That one on the left, with the 3 pine trees at the far right." Dan squinted against the mist coming up off the bow and nodded. He kept the little boat's nose pointed toward the island, and as they drew closer to it, he felt an uncomfortable chill settle in his bones. "Do you feel it?" May asked excitedly. "Yup," Dan said, grinning. Only twice before had they encountered anything resembling a ghost, and the chill then was nothing compared to what emanated from the island. Less than 5 minutes later they were close enough for Dan to ease back on the throttle and get a look at their destination. A short, decrepit pier extended out into the water, and there seemed to be a deep shadow beneath it, as if something were in the water, staining it. The trees came down to the shore, and only a narrow path wound its way from the end of the pier and up into the foliage beyond. No birds sang from the trees. No fish could be seen swimming near the island. "This place is bad," Dan thought, and he shuddered involuntarily. "Really bad." "Hey, May," he said. She turned and smiled at him. "What's up?" "Do you think this is a good idea?" he asked, hating the weakness in his voice. "Yes," May said, her smile never faltering. "We both know what to do if there's a malignant spirit around, Dan. We don't have anything to be afraid of." "But we do," Dan wanted to say as he guided the boat into the pier. "Don't you feel it?" But he didn't speak his thoughts. May's dedication to the project was almost maniacal at times. She had planned out every last aspect of the cross-country trip with the same devotion of a new mother creating a keepsake for her unborn child. To voice an opinion that May didn't espouse would, Dan knew, be seen as almost traitorous. With a sigh, he turned off the engine and let the boat glide the last dozen feet or so to the pier, where the entirety of the structure shook when jostled. Dan winced at the sight of it. "May, we need to be careful," he said as she stood up and shouldered her pack. "The pier?" she asked. He nodded. "I'll check it first," she said, and quickly climbed out of the boat. Dan felt ill, his stomach rolling and twisting as he watched his wife take a wide-legged stance on the old boards. "It'll be close," May said after a moment, "but it's doable. Plus, the water's not too deep here. We could probably walk out to the boat if we needed to." "I wish we could beach it," Dan said, tossing a line up to her. "I know," she replied, securing the rope to one of the pier's firmer posts. He stood, put on his own pack, and stepped onto the pier. Instantly, it moved beneath his feet, a powerful sense of undulation, like a monstrous snake sliding toward the couple, prepared to devour them. "Are you okay?" May asked, concern in her light gray eyes. "Yeah," Dan said, swallowing dryly and forcing a smile. "Why?" "You're grinding your teeth, babe," she said, putting a small, delicate hand on his cheek and smiling at him. "You can stay here with the boat if this is too much." He grinned and shook his head. No, I'm good. The pier just took me a little off guard. I'll be fine once I get on land. Then I will lead the way," she said, winking. She turned and started up the pier, picking her way carefully, and for a moment, Dan watched her. The only woman in the world who can wear off-the-rack khakis and make them look good, he thought, grinning. Once she was a fair distance ahead of him, Dan followed, wary of loose and rotten boards. By the time he reached the island, May was playfully tapping her foot, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're late," she said, grinning. "I am never late," he said with magnificent, mock defiance. "I arrive precisely when I mean to." All right, May said. "Are you ready?" Dan adjusted his pack straps, nodded and said, "I am ready." "Good," she said. From the breast pocket of her gray hiking blouse, she retrieved a laminated piece of paper the size of a funeral card. On it, she had printed all the pertinent information on Blutinsel she could find on the internet. "So," May said, "according to the sources, there should be a house in the center of the island, a well, and barn." Dan looked around at the thick trunks of the tall trees, the rocky soil and the heavy undergrowth, and asked, how in the hell could they do anything here? "Well, it seems like Fritz Blutt, an Austrian immigrant, decided he could build whatever he needed to," May answered. Then she flipped the card over and said, "However, after 22 years, the entire family vanished in 1922. Not a trace of them." "And that's when the sightings began?" Dan asked. "Yup," May said, nodding. "So, want to start with the house?" "Probably best," Dan said, "if they vanished like that." She smiled, held out her hand, and Dan took it in his own. Together, they strolled up the narrow path that climbed steeply toward a slim choke point between a pair of massive pine trees. Dan tilted his head slightly, frowned and asked, "Did you notice that there aren't any birds?" "Yup," May said. "No animals either. Lots of berries and low-hanging edibles. And not a single animal." "Classic signs," Dan said, and a sense of excitement writhed in his stomach. He loved the hunt for the dead, spotting a fleeting image, or seeing a globe of light when reviewing film footage. Ghostly answers on recordings. And he loved to do it all with May. They reached the choke point, and May whispered, "Oh, Dan, look." He did, and they came to a stop, staring at the home of Fritz Blutt. The long-missing Austrian had built a small, but powerful home out of native stone. Before them was a miniature castle, with battlements and narrow windows. A heavy door, crafted from wood and bound with iron, stood in the center of the wall, and an overhang from the second floor gave the door protection from the elements. Or attackers, Dan thought. The land around the house was cleared for a fair distance, and sunlight streamed down, bathing the dull gray rock in brilliant light. Light reflected in the stained glass windows set in the second floor. Why aren't they broken? Dan thought. Or stolen? They're beautiful. And even from the crest of the small rise, he could see the images in the stained glass. Knights battling dragons and demons. Without a word, Dan and May started to walk again. They moved quickly, following a worn path leading to the front door of the home. The temperature lowered gradually as they approached the iron-bound door. May looked at him. "Do you feel it?" Her voice was hushed, as though they were in a church and not mere feet away from an abandoned house on a lonely island. Yeah, Dan said, and his attention was grabbed by movement to his right. He glanced toward it, saw nothing, and shook his head, thinking, probably a rabbit or a squirrel. It wasn't until May was opening the door that Dan remembered there was no sign of life anywhere on the island. May crossed the threshold and Dan, still holding her hand, went with her. A slightly musty scent, mingled with both cinnamon and nutmeg, stung their noses as they entered the house. When his eyes adjusted, Dan saw the home was essentially open concept, with a set of slim stairs leading to a loft that served, he had no doubt, as bedrooms for the family. The house was sparsely populated with furniture, but the pieces were elegantly carved, their smooth lines and decorations still clear beneath a heavy layer of dust. Family photos hung along the wall near a wide hearth, around which, Dan was certain, the family spent a great deal of time. Lead soldiers were lined up, facing off against one another a few feet from the fireplace, and a book was beside the soldiers. Moving further into the house, they saw the kitchen. A large, thick farmer's table occupied the center of the room, with 4 chairs around it. What? Dan asked in a soft voice, stepping forward. The table was set, knives and forks on or near plates. Serving dishes barren of food occupied the center of the table, and empty glasses stood guard at barren plates. Did they just vanish? Dan asked. I don't think so, May whispered, and pointed to the floor. Beneath the table was a revolver, a great, monstrous pistol that was ugly and foul to gaze upon. Damn, May, Dan whispered. This place is bad. She nodded her agreement. We going to call it quits and just go back, like the old guy at the store said? Dan asked. May smiled weakly and said, hell, no. Dan shook his head in dismay. Come on, May, we've never done a place like this. It's so wrong, he said. I know, May replied. That's why we have to do it. Because we've never done anything like it. Not even remotely close to it. Dan groaned, but he didn't argue. Let's set up by the fireplace, she said, nodding toward the soldiers and the book. We'll put some of the equipment out, record for an hour or so, and then we'll leave. I want something from here, Dan. Anything. Okay, he said grudgingly. Let's do it. They went and sat down in 2 chairs in front of the fireplace, setting their packs on the dusty floor and quickly taking out their recording equipment. Once everything was set up, the batteries checked and working, they settled down. This is May and Dan Shea, she said, preparing to ask questions on Blood Island. May glanced at him, and Dan nodded. She started with the basic questions about who was in the house, what happened to them, and if there was anything they wanted the living to know. After each inquiry, May would pause to give the dead time to answer, and after several seconds of silence, she would move on to the next. Dan watched the green indicator lights on each device, making certain nothing was siphoning off the power from the batteries. Satisfied all was well and tuning out May as she continued her litany of questions, he reached out and picked up a toy soldier. The lead paint was faded and worn away in some places, and the figure was in a standing position, his rifle at his shoulder. Dan smiled, put the toy down and picked up another. The green light on the video recorder flickered, faded, then plunged to red. Dan dropped the toy to the floor and said, May. She stopped, and as she did so, the audio recorder went red. A moment later, all the devices were off. Well, she said, I guess that's a sign. I guess it is, Dan said. I just want to get the hell out of here, he thought. He reached down into the bag with the spare batteries, and screamed, jerking his hand out. What? May yelled. What is it? I don't know. Dan snapped, and he picked up the bag and dumped the contents onto the floor. The extra batteries tumbled out, as did a lead toy soldier. The small figure lay on its back, the crooked and dull rifle pointing toward the ceiling. Dan's heart beat unsteadily and a vein in his temple pulsed. "Dan," May said softly, "did you put that in there?" He shook his head. "Yeah," she said, clearing her throat. "Yeah. I didn't think so." Dan's nostrils flared as he picked up a strange scent. Something bitter and acrid, an almost ashen taste on the back of his tongue. "Do you smell that?" May whispered. "Yes," he said. He saw his hands tremble, and he stuffed them under his legs to keep them still. "What is it?" she asked. Nervously, he inhaled through his nose and sampled the scent. A memory rushed back. Oh no," he said, shaking his head. "What is it, Dan?" May asked. "You remember last year, when we were in Boston?" he asked in return. She nodded. "Okay, you remember that little parade or whatever it was that we saw?" He felt his palms grow damp with sweat. "The guys we laughed at? The ones dressed up like Revolutionary War soldiers?" Her eyes widened and she looked down at the soldier. "Gunpowder," May whispered. The smell filled the room, and Dan half expected to see a living soldier step out of one of the darkened shadows. "May," Dan said in a hushed tone, "May, sweetheart, we need to leave, okay?" She shook her head vehemently. "No," she said fiercely. "Dan, this is incredible. We're getting olfactory stimulation. Come on, get the batteries out of the equipment." Dan's heart sank as he began stripping the drained batteries out and passing the pieces of gear over to her. She rapidly replaced them, a strange, eager expression on her face. Her entire body thrummed with excitement while his threatened to shake itself apart with fear. Too much, he thought, handing her the last voice recorder. Too much. She put the batteries in, hit record and set it down between them. Then, she lifted up the chatterbox. When she turned it on, the small electrical device warbled and screeched as it flipped through dozens of static-filled channels. Holding the chatterbox in her hands, she leaned over it and listened. Repressing a groan, Dan did the same. A soft humming sound pierced the static and Dan jerked his head back in alarm. May grinned at him before she asked, "Can you hear me?" The roar of a gun tore out of the chatterbox and caused both Dan and May to cry out in dismay. She dropped the device and it crashed to the floor, breaking and going instantly silent. "Damn it!" May said. She reached down to pick it up and stopped. Beside the broken chatterbox was a toy soldier. But it wasn't the one that had come out of the bag with the batteries. Or any of those scattered closer to the fireplace. The soldier was a drummer, with one drumstick on the instrument's skin and the other raised above it. "Where the hell did that come from?" May asked. The quick rat-a-tat-tat of a military drum came from the silenced speaker of the chatterbox. It was taken up a moment later by a second drum, then a third, and a fourth. A scraping sound beneath Dan's chair caused him to look cautiously beneath it, and when he did, he hissed with fear. "What?" May asked. Dan's hand shook badly as he reached underneath and removed what he had seen. Holding it in his closed fist, he opened his fingers and revealed a toy fife player. A split second later the piercing wail of a military fifer joined the chorus of drummers. "No," Dan said, dropping the fifer to the floor. "No, this isn't right. That can't happen." "Well, it is," May said, anger tinging her fear. "Come on," Dan said, standing up. "Let's call it quits, May." She glared at him, a look so fierce he felt as if she had struck him. "Don't quit," May said in a tight voice. "We can't. Dan, Han, this is amazing. We cannot lose this opportunity." "Lose an opportunity?" His incredulity filled his words. May, this is beyond opportunity time. This is, hey, let's get the hell out of Dodge time. Whatever is here, it's in charge, and I don't think we should be here anymore. A muscle twitched on her jaw and she rubbed at her chin. Sit down, hon, please, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Dan did so. This is weird, she said, nodding. This is intense. But it really is an opportunity for us. Not only will we get an incredible, one-of-a-kind experience, but this is going to be a huge step up for us in the ghost hunting game. You know that, right? Right, he said grudgingly. All we have to do is stay here a little longer, she said soothingly. That's it. When we get a little info, we'll pick up our stuff and head back. I promise. Dan wanted to say no. To argue the point some more. To tell her he was going to wait for her at the boat. But he didn't. He wouldn't say no. He wouldn't argue or tell her he would be at the boat with the engine running. May was his, and he was hers. He was going to stay beside her. All right, he whispered, and his response was punctuated by the sudden, rolling blast of a line of musketry. Dan shivered, took several deep breaths, and nodded to her. Hand me that recorder again, will you please, she asked. Yeah, Dan whispered. He picked up the recorder, and as he handed it to her, the light died again, making the device nothing more than a useless piece of plastic and electronics. She shook her head, put it back on the floor and turned to face the room once more. Hello, May said to the air, is there anyone here with us? The room darkened, imperceptibly at first, then gradually, until Dan had a difficult time seeing May beside him. Do you want to speak with us? May asked. Dan was surprised to hear a tremble in her voice. Her usual steadfastness was replaced with a hint of fear that frightened him. We should go, Dan whispered. Why did you come? A voice whispered. It was a child's voice, curious and sad at the same time. To speak with you, May answered, her fear overcome with excitement. With me? The child asked. But why? We wanted to know why you're still here, May said. We wanted to know what happened. I'm here because this is my home, the child said. And we're here because Mama got angry. Wait, May said, surprised, who else is here? Mama and Papa, Florence, too, the child said. She's my sister. What's your name? May asked. Nicky, the child answered. Nicholas Blutt. Dan suddenly felt cold fingers moving up both arms. Nicky, Dan said in a husky, shaky voice, is that you touching me? No, the dead boy said in a low voice. That's Mama. Could you ask her to stop? Please. Dan whispered. Nicky said something in a language Dan assumed was German, and the dead woman's grip tightened painfully. That didn't work, Dan said, fighting back the shrill fear climbing into his throat. The dead woman's hand squeezed. Dan. May asked, reaching out for him. As her fingers touched his arm, May screamed and was hurled across the room, out of sight. May. Fear fled from him and he got to his feet, only to be knocked down. Across the room, in the darkness, he heard May shriek, the sound a combination of agony and fear. May. Dan howled, trying to move. But his arms were pinned against his side and, as he lay on the floor, staring up into the dim ceiling, he felt the wood vibrate. With each vibration, May's cries filled the room. Dan tried to sit up but was slammed back down, his head bouncing off the hardwood floor. A heavy weight pressed down on his chest and he heard the dead boy's voice mere inches from him. Did you know, Nicky said, that my family listens to me? Let us go. Dan snarled, struggling to free himself from the dead woman's grasp. The dead boy ignored him. "We were at dinner, and I didn't want to eat anymore," Nicky explained. "I didn't want to play anymore. I didn't want anything, anymore. So, my family waited at the table while I got Papa's revolver. I shot Florence, then Mama. Papa and I carried their bodies to the well and dropped them in. Then, Papa knelt down, and I smashed his head against the well, and dropped him in, too. When I was done, I went into the well too. And now we're all here." A dull, sickening thud filled the air, and May finally stopped screaming. "Ah," Nicky said with satisfaction. "Have you ever seen someone's skull split open? It's rather nice. Sort of like seeing an egg break, but far messier." Papa's brains were all over the inside of the well. "May!" Dan shrieked. "Shush," Nicky whispered. "You're terribly loud. And you're rude." Small hands gripped either side of Dan's head tightly, and Nicky whispered fiercely, "You shouldn't have touched my soldiers. Those are mine. My mama and Papa gave them to me." Dan's head was pulled up off the floor slightly. "You shouldn't have touched them at all," Nicky hissed. Dan tried to scream for May once more, but the dead child tightened his grip and slammed Dan's head against the floor. And Dan whimpered as his skull broke, like an eggshell. Next story. Trip trapped Sherilyn Kenyon and Kevin J. Anderson. He huddled under the bridge and hid from the world outside, as he had done for as long as he could remember. No, he could remember a time before that, but he didn't like those thoughts, and he buried them away whenever they appeared. The bridge was old and unimpressive, long ago marred by spray-painted graffiti, mostly faded now. The county road extended from an Alabama state highway and crossed over a creek that was more of a drainage ditch, overrun with weeds and populated with garbage tossed out from the occasional passing car. Brambles, dogwoods, and milkweed grew tall enough to provide some shelter for his lair. Scary lurked in the shadows next to piled cans, mud-encrusted debris he had hauled out of the noisome drainage ditch, a bent and discarded child's bicycle, struck by a car. A stained blanket provided very little warmth and no softness, but he clung to it nevertheless. It was his. All the comforts of home. He had a shopping cart with a broken wheel, piled high with the few possessions he had bothered to keep over a long time. He hunched his back against the rough concrete abutment, shifting position. The dirt and gravel beneath him was a far cry from the grassy, flower-strewn meadow he sometimes saw in his dreams. He didn't belong in meadows anymore, just here in the shadows, standing watch at the nightmare gate. He had to guard it. Scary wouldn't leave his post. The tall milkweed rustled aside, and he looked up at the freckled face of a skinny little girl. "I see you there," she said. "Are you a troll?" Scary tensed, half rose from his crouch. Many layers of tattered and filthy clothing covered his skin, masked his monstrous features. The girl just blinked at him. "What are you doing here?" When he inhaled a quick breath, through the humidity in the odors of the drainage ditch, he could smell the little girl. The tender little girl. "My brother says you're a troll, 'cause trolls live under bridges." "You're living under a bridge," the girl said. "So, are you a troll?" Yes, he was, but she didn't know that. In fact, no one was allowed to know that. "No. Not a troll," he lied. She smelled tender, savory, juicy. "Come closer." The girl was intrigued by him, but she hesitated. She was smart enough for that at least. Scary squeezed his eyes shut and drove his head back against the concrete abutment of the bridge. Again. The pain was like a gunshot through his skull, but at least it drove away the dark thoughts. Sometimes it just got so lonely, and he got so hungry here. He'd been thinking about eating children, tasty children, thinking about it altogether too much. With a crash through the underbrush, a boy came down the embankment. Her brother. He looked about 9, a year or 2 older than the girl. Both were scrawny, their clothes hand-me-downs but still in much better condition than Scari's. The children did have a raggedness about them, though, a touch of loss that had not yet grown into desperation. That would come in time, Scary knew, unless he ate them first. Next to his sister, the boy made a grimace and said with a taunting bravery that only fools and children could manage, "I think you're a troll. You smell like a troll." Scary leaned forward, lurched closer to the edge of the shadow, and the children drew back, but remained close, staring. "Methinks you smell yourself, boy." Rather than hearing the threat, the boy giggled. "Methinks? What kind of word is methinks?" He added in a sing-song voice, Methinks is a stupid word." Scary grumbled, ground his teeth together. His gums were sore. He picked at them with a yellowed fingernail. No wonder witches ate children. It was sounding like a better and better idea to him. His stomach rumbled. He wanted to lunge out from the gloom, but he knew the nightmare gate was there somewhere behind him, just waiting for him to let down his guard. Scary had been assigned here to stand watch, sentenced to stay here. For many centuries, evil had bubbled up from the depths of the world, and the nightmare gates through which demons traveled always appeared underneath bridges. Scary couldn't leave his post, had to stay here and protect against anything that might come out. It made no sense to him why a vulnerable spot might appear under this small county road bridge in northern Alabama, but it was not for Scary to understand. He hadn't felt the evil gate in some time, although there was plenty of evil in him. "How long have you been there, mister?" asked the girl. "Longer than you've been alive." A car peeled off the highway and drove along the county road. Its engine was loud and dyspeptic, one tire mostly flat so that as the car crossed the bridge overhead, it made a staccato trip-trap trip-trap trip-trip-trap. "What's your name?" the boy asked, as if it were his turn to dare. His name. Yes, he had a name. Other people had called him by name, laughed with him, even a beautiful maiden who had once whispered it in his ear. But not anymore. He had no friends, no home, just what he clung to under this bridge where he stood guard. But he did have a name. Scary. "Scary Scary," the boy shouted, and the girl laughed with him. "Come closer." He was so hungry for those children, so anxious to emerge into the sunlight again, even though it would cause him pain, make him twist and writhe. Scary grew ill from the very thought. It might be worth the pain, though, just for a bit of freedom or maybe just for a taste of fresh meat. "Billy. Kenna. Leave the poor man alone." The 2 children whirled, startled. They looked as if they'd been caught at something. Their mother came up, a woman on the edge of 30, her brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. She wore no makeup, but her face was washed clean. Her clothes also had that worn look to them. "He's a troll, Ma, he lives under a bridge," said the girl, Kenna. "He smells," said Billy. The mother looked mortally embarrassed, rounded up the 2 as she peered under the bridge where Scary huddled with all his possessions. "I am so incredibly sorry they disturbed you. What can I say?" She hauled the children out of the weeds, maybe to keep them safe from him. They both flunked home training, but it wasn't from lack of effort on my part. She sounded conversational, a forced friendliness, as if she felt they had something in common. "Why does he live under a bridge, Ma?" Kenna asked. Scary was startled to see the woman hesitate. A bright sheen of tears suddenly appeared in her eyes. "Just be thankful we don't live there." He heard the unspoken yet in her voice. "It's all right," Scary said. "They weren't bothering me." His stomach growled, but not loudly enough for anyone else to hear. I've been called worse than smelly, and that by my own family. Well, I appreciate your understanding. I'm Johanna. It was nice meeting you. She seemed uncomfortable, backing down the embankment, protecting her children, and good thing. She didn't want them talking to strangers, especially ones who hid under bridges. Especially trolls. The air was full of the whine of insects, laden with ozone. Overhead, dark thunderheads clotted. If a downpour came, it would make the humidity more tolerable for a while. We need to get back to the car, kids, Johanna said. It's the only shelter we've got. I don't want to go back and sit in the car, Ma. It's hot. Been there for days. There's nothing to do, Billy added. When are we gonna keep driving? As soon as we get gas money. Somebody'll come by. Whenever Scary saw people, they were from the cars that stopped at the rest area on the highway next to the bridge. It had beige metal picnic tables, trash cans, running water, restrooms, and not much else. Not even traffic. Scary had seen vehicles come and go, and most of them didn't stay long, but now he remembered a rusted station wagon piled with belongings. It had been there a while. He thought he'd heard a loud muffler, a struggling engine, tires crunching gravel, doors slamming, 2 nights ago. Johanna and her children probably had a handwritten sign on a scrap of cardboard asking for help with gas money or food. Scary tried to remember how to make conversation. Some part of him didn't want the family to go away, not yet. Are you having trouble, ma'am? No, yes, maybe. Which is it? All of the above. But it's my problem. Don't trouble yourself. Scary glanced behind him, sensed the nightmare gate. But the barrier was strong, stable, as it had been for many years. Nothing was trying to get through right now. He ambled closer to her, taking comfort in the thunderclouds that muted the afternoon sunlight. We don't got a home no more, Kenna said. The mean man made us leave. What mean man? Their mother let out a heavy sigh. We were evicted. I lost my job a year ago and haven't been able to find another one. I used up my savings, and we're trying to make it to Michigan where my cousin lives. Michigan? He didn't have much familiarity with maps anymore, but he did understand that Michigan was a long way from northern Alabama. We'll manage somehow, the mother said. Fat raindrops started to strike the ground. We just need a little to get by, step by step. If we make it to Michigan, we can have a fresh start. Her expression tightened, as if she had forgotten about him entirely. We'll find a way to survive. Before he could stop himself, Scary blurted out, It's not so bad. You and the girl could live off the fat of the boy for at least 3 days. Johanna's eyes widened and she drew back, startled. Billy thought it was a joke and he nudged his sister. They wouldn't want me anyway. Girls are the ones made out of sugar and spice and everything nice. Scary's stomach rumbled. Don't believe too many fairy tales. The rain began falling in earnest, thick drops pattering and hissing. All around them like whispered laughter. Johanna grabbed the 2 children. Come on, back to the car. She flashed a glance over her shoulder, then ran with a squealing Kenna and Billy off to the rest area. Scary went back under his bridge, took up his post at the long-sealed nightmare gate, and watched the world as the rain washed the scent of children from the air. Water ran down the side of the bridge, trickles turning his dank and gloomy lair into a soupy mess. Scary just huddled there. The bug seemed to enjoy it, though. Even after the storm stopped, leaving only leftover droplets wrung out from the sky, he heard frogs wake up in the creek. Something splashed in a puddle farther downstream. It wasn't yet full dark, but the clouds hadn't cleared. All the burbling background noise masked the sound of stealthy footsteps, and the fresh rain covered the girl's scent until she appeared. "Mr. Scary, are you hungry?" He was startled. The appetite became ravenous within him. Was she taunting him? He could lunge out right now, grab her before she could run, use his dagger to break her up into delectable pieces, roast her meat over a fire and have a feast. But after the rain, he'd never be able to build a fire. No matter, he was hungry enough to eat her raw. Scary slammed his head against the abutment again to drive away the thoughts. No, no. The hungers, the dark desires had always been gnawing in him, but he could fight them back. He could. Kenna extended a rumpled white paper sack. "I brought hamburgers. Do you like fast food?" "No, I don't like fast food. I want something slow enough I can catch." "Hamburgers?" he asked, his voice a croak. "Somebody gave them to us at the rest area. They're leftovers. Mostly good, but the fries are cold and soggy. I wanted to offer you the last one. Ma doesn't know I'm here." She extended the sack closer, and with a quick movement he might have been able to snatch her wrist. "It's still fine. Only a bite taken out of it." With a sense of wonder, Scary took the sack and pulled it open. An explosion of wondrous smells struck him in the face. His mouth watered. He was so hungry. He stuffed the burger into his mouth, fished around with his paws in the bottom of the bag to grab every small, withered French fry. "Thank you," he said, his words muffled around the food. Tears stung his eyes. He remembered feasting with some of the other warriors, a delicious banquet thrown by the victorious lord after a particularly long and bloody battle. They had slain countless scaly demons that day, driven them back through the nightmare gate and barricaded it under a stone bridge. Scary remembered how much blood there was in the air on the battlefield, how the smoking black demon blood had a sour acid smell, unlike the vibrant freshness of the roasted boar in the Lord's fire pit, unseasoned meat shimmering with grease. He and his fellow foot soldiers had eaten the celebratory feast, drinking the Lord's best wine and his cheapest ale. It was all so delicious. That was before Scary had failed, before he had been cursed, before he'd been given this sacred duty. He finished the food now, licked his crusted lips, and straightened, searching for his scraps of pride and memory as desperately as he looked for more fries. "Is this your stuff?" Kenna was rummaging in his shopping cart, moving aside the piled possessions he had gathered over the years, decades, centuries. He sucked in his breath. He didn't dare let her find his weapons, the spell-sealed dagger. "Get away from there." The girl jerked back. "You shouldn't be here. Go back to your mother, your family." He raised himself up, and Kenna looked awed and terrified as Scary grew and swelled, an ominous lurching shape under the bridge. She backed away, stumbling in the weeds. Scary lowered his voice, speaking more to himself than to her. "You have a family. Don't forget that." She ran back to their forlorn station wagon, and he heard her crying, which made his heart heavy. Another stone of guilt, another failure, another thing to atone for. But Kenna had her brother, her mother, a mother who actually cared for her children. Scary's mother hadn't been like that. When he'd run away to fight in the demon wars, he'd been cocky, full of false bravado, sure that no nightmare monster breaking out of hell could be worse than the shrewish woman who had beaten him, starved him at home. He'd been so wrong about that. For a while, his comrades had become his family. The clerics had blessed them all, the noblemen had armed them, the wizards provided magical talismans with blades dipped in blood silver that could strike down demons. In the first two engagements, Scary had been out of the fray, far from where the monsters boiled out from beneath the bridge. Warlords and armed warriors had fought the slavering demons, while clerics and wizards struggled to seal and barricade the nightmare gate. Skari was terrified, but uninjured, and the war went on. In the third battle, though, when the fanged and clawed monsters turned, charging into the pathetic group of Skari and his friends, he watched his best comrade, Torin, die. Torin was a baker's boy from the same village. They'd run off together, and Skari saw the demons tear him apart, twisting Torin's arms and legs from his torso like the bones from a well-roasted quail carcass. Another demon had bitten off Hern's head. The long-haired tanner's apprentice had feminine features and a cocky smile, and the fanged monster had opened its hinged jaws, engulfed the boy's entire head, bit down, then spat it out amid a gout of foul breath. Hern's head had struck Skari right in the chest. He didn't remember dropping his sword or running screaming past all the other soldiers. Many hundreds of human soldiers had died that day, but the demons were driven back at an incredible cost of brave blood. Skari, though, was captured by the Lord's men, found to be a coward, sentenced to be executed by a headsman's axe. But he was given a choice that he hadn't known was so terrible. The wizards offered him the opportunity to become the guardian of a sealed gate, to be made immortal, to stand watch in case the nightmare hordes ever tried to break free again. Babbling, Skari had agreed. He dropped to his knees weeping, begging them to make him a guardian. He had not known that choice would be worse than simply dying. Skari had lost his family, his friends, everyone and everything. He had been alone for centuries, moved from bridge to bridge when it was deemed necessary, when a new vulnerable spot appeared anywhere in the world. "Your job is to protect mankind," the wizard had said. The Lord who stood before him had a grim, heartless face. He had lost a hand in the last battle. He had seen Skari run in terror from the monsters, and Skari knew he had earned his isolated eternity. His crime was not so great that he deserved hell itself, but bad enough for him to be sentenced to this purgatory. His fate, his job, was to protect humans against evil, even though his close proximity to the nightmare gates had twisted him, too. He could never let the evil escape again. He couldn't let it get to Johanna and her 2 children. He turned to the bridge wall behind him where he could sense the simmering gate. It had been quiet, silent, but he dare not let his guard down. Dare not leave, dare not have hope. He clenched his filthy, scabbed fist and hammered against the hard wall. "I hate you." Nothing was worse than to be trapped alone where you didn't want to be. While he kept the nightmare gate guarded, he thought of Kenna and Billy, homeless, penniless, cast out by a mean man, vulnerable to human predators and unkind fate. Even if the demon wars were over, the darkness of human society was heartless, too. At least the demons were obvious enemies, and they could be defeated. His thoughts kept going to the woman and her children. How could he defend against the troubles Johanna faced? The family was like the one he'd never had. Maybe that was another part of his punishment, to feel such helplessness after he'd begun to sense a connection. But what could he do? "We just need a little to get by step, Johanna had said. "If we make it to Michigan, we can have a fresh start." As he thought of them, he sighed. They were the ones he fought for. But if he simply ignored their very real, though not supernatural, plight, he might as well let the evil behind the nightmare gate eat them. It would be like running away from the battlefield, a coward again. He went to his cart and dug through his cluttered possessions, the detritus and treasures piled and packed there until he found the last few things he had from his original life in another time, another world, a thick gold medallion, 1 small ring, and a handful of silver coins, spoils from his first battlefields. The trinkets had amounted to a fortune even then, an even greater one today. For centuries, he'd kept them safe. Now, they would help a young mother and her children reach safety. It was full night, and the nightmare gate seemed strong, stable. He sensed no whispers of evil back there, only emptiness. But he did feel the pain and the need of Johanna and her children. Half-hearted rain began to fall as he trudged to the parking lot of the rest area. The station wagon was dark, closed up for the night as the family huddled there for shelter, safer and warmer than under a bridge. It was the only vehicle there. A single white mercury light shed a pool of illumination over the picnic tables. A metal sign peppered with divots from shotgun pellets said "No overnight parking, strictly enforced." But no one had bothered to enforce it for days. Shambling forward, a looming shadow surrounded by deeper shadows, Scary approached the driver's side window and thumped on it. He heard a startled gasp from behind the glass, the children stirring. He saw the glint of the mother's eyes. She was concerned. Ready to fight. In the darkness, they would be able to discern his gargantuan size, but unable to see his ugly twisted features, his scabrous skin. He held up the pouch. "Didn't mean to scare you, ma'am. I just thought this would help you get on your way." Johanna rolled down the window just enough for him to push the pouch through. She took it, and he turned, not wanting to speak with her, not waiting for her to see what he had given them. Scary ambled back into the night, hurrying before any demons could discover the unguarded nightmare gate, before he would have to endure the mother telling him thank you. And no more than an hour later, as he sat in the damp gloom of his lair, Johanna, Billy, and Kenna appeared under the bridge, walking closer. They weren't afraid of him. The mother held the sack with the medallion, the ring, the old coins. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can. Those things do me no good, but for you they can make the difference. Buy yourself a new chance." He tried to remember how to soften his words with humor. "It should keep you from having to eat the boy for at least a week." She laughed, and her brow furrowed. "It'll keep us from living under a bridge." The boy and girl gathered closer, and they all looked at Scary. Johanna's face was tight, and he saw tears in her eyes. "This is the nicest thing anyone's ever done for us." "Thank you." The little girl burst forward, threw herself against him, and hugged him tight. "You're not a monster." Billy nodded and said strangely, "You're saved. I'm glad we didn't have to kill you." No sooner had the boy spoken than pain shot into Scary's body. He hissed as it burned through him, screaming through his muscle fibers. His skin began to boil and discolor. Underneath his layers of old, crusted clothing, his body twisted in a spasm. He bent over and threw himself against the bridge abutment, his mind ringing with terror. Were these people escaped demons? Had they come here to attack him? He staggered into his shopping cart, grabbed it. He had to get the blood-silver dagger, defend himself, defend the world, but the cart crashed to one side. Unable to stand the pain, Scary doubled over, dropped to the muddy, garbage-strewn ground, and shrank. Confused, Scary looked at hands that were no longer gnarled ugly paws. They were hands again. Human hands. He flexed his arms, pushed himself to his feet. The mother and children stood before him, watching, but their eyes didn't look evil. In fact, they seemed glad and relieved. "The demon wars were over long ago," said Johanna. "The nightmare gates are permanently sealed, but after all this time, the guardians themselves have become dangerous." Billy added, "Not only were you immortal, you became inhuman, too, so close to the darkness that it found a home in you. We've been sent to find the last few remaining trolls, to test them," Kenna said in a voice that did not belong to a little girl. "To see if they need to be destroyed, or if they have remembered human decency and compassion. You, Scary, are one of the last. We were afraid for you." Instead of the eyes of a little boy, Billy's eyes were hard and ancient. "But you convinced even me." "You are free now," Johanna said. "The world is safe from demons and it is safe from you." Kenna grinned, and her eyes sparkled. "We release you from your post."